The explosions had stopped an hour ago, which somehow made everything worse. Mira pressed her hand against the cold window of the council chamber and watched smoke rise from the northern districts. Each column represented hundreds of dead, maybe thousands. The Dominion ships hung in orbit like dark moons, their weapons silent now that they had destroyed the last of the defense platforms. "How long?" she asked without turning around. The military advisor, an older Talaran named Ven, checked his tablet with shaking hands. 72 hours. Maybe less. They're repositioning for planetary bombardment. Mira finally turned to face the council. 12 faces looked back at her, all showing the same expression. Defeat. They had tried everything. Diplomacy had failed when the Dominion ambassador simply laughed at their treaties. Their small fleet of cargo haulers and patrol ships had been swept aside in the first engagement, like insects against a storm. Even their allies had abandoned them, too afraid of Dominion retaliation to risk helping. "We have one option left," Mira said quietly. "The Forbidden Protocol," several council members gasped. One of them, a female named Tess, stood up so fast her chair fell backward. "You can't be serious. Broadcasting our location to the entire galaxy? Every pirate, every scavenger, every hostile species will know exactly where we are." "They already know where we are," Mira said. "The Dominion found us. At least this way someone might help." "No one will help," Ven said, his voice hollow. "We've sent private requests to 47 systems. All of them refused or ignored us. Why would a public distress call be any different?" Mira walked to the center of the room. Her legs felt heavy. She had not slept in 3 days. Because shame works differently when everyone is watching. A private refusal costs nothing, but ignoring a public cry for help while an entire species dies, that becomes part of history. The council voted. It was close. 7 in favor, 5 against. Mira gave the order, and within minutes every transmitter on Sanctuary began broadcasting the same message on every frequency. It was simple. They were dying. They needed help. These were their coordinates. Across the city, in a research station built into the side of a mountain, a young scientist named Paul monitored the distress signal's reach. His specialty was long-range communications, which had been a quiet, boring job until 3 days ago. Now he watched as their desperate message spread across the galaxy like ripples in a pond. Most species simply ignored it. Some sent brief acknowledgments that meant nothing. "We hear your distress. We cannot assist." Paul logged each response, feeling hope drain away with each polite refusal. The Dominion had made examples of species who helped their targets before. No one wanted to be next. Hour 12, nothing. Hour 24, still nothing. Paul ate his meals at his station, watching the signal bounce between relay stations reaching farther into space. His assistant, a female named Beth, brought him food he barely touched. "Maybe we should go home," Beth suggested. "Spend the time with family." "Maybe," Paul said, but he did not leave. Something kept him there. Hope maybe, or just the inability to accept the end. Hour 36 brought something different. A response from a species Paul did not recognize. The signal was strong, which meant they were relatively close. The message was brief. "Humanity en route. Hold position." Paul stared at the words. Humanity. He searched the database. They were a recent addition to the galactic community, only 40 years since first contact. Their file was thin. They had stayed mostly isolated, establishing trade posts but avoiding the major political systems. There were notes about their unusual biology, high endurance, adaptable, omnivorous. Nothing about military strength. He ran to find Mira. The council was in session, discussing evacuation procedures for the children. Paul burst in without permission, which would have gotten him arrested under normal circumstances. Now no one cared about protocol. "Someone responded," he said, gasping for air. "Humanity. They say they're coming." Mira pulled up the human file on the main screen. The council studied it in silence. "They have no military fleet listed," Tess said finally. "Just commercial vessels and science ships. Why would they respond if they can't help?" Another council member asked. Ben was reading something on his tablet, his face growing pale. "I found something. Cultural exchange files from 10 years ago. Historical records they shared." He looked up at Mira. "These humans, they have an entire category of history they call world wars. Planet-wide conflicts. The second one killed over 70 million of them." The room went silent. Most species had conflicts, but the scale Venn described was incomprehensible. The entire Talaran population was only 8 billion. That was their past, Mira said carefully. Many species have violent histories. Their past was 80 years ago, Venn said. Some of them who fought in those wars are still alive. Paul felt cold. He had been hoping for help. But what if they had called something worse than the Dominion? Still, they had no choice. The Dominion ships continued their slow repositioning. In 60 hours, the bombardment would begin. Mira ordered the evacuation to proceed as planned, while they waited to see if the humans would actually arrive. Most people assumed it was a cruel joke or a misunderstanding. On the third day, Paul was at his station when every alert system went off at once. Long-range sensors had detected something at the edge of the system. A single small ship moving fast. It entered the system, performed high-speed scans of everything, and vanished back into slipspace before the Dominion fleet even noticed. Paul's hands shook as he typed a message to Mira. They're real, and they're scouting us. The humans were coming. Whether that was salvation or another nightmare, they would know soon enough. War Master Krieg reviewed the reports with barely concealed boredom. The Talaran defense had crumbled faster than predicted, which meant the schedule was ahead of plan. His fleet of 200 warships surrounded the planet like a net. Nothing got in or out. In 60 hours, the bombardment would begin. Another species would be erased, and the Dominion would add another system to its territory. Sir, intelligence reports the Talaran broadcast a distress call, his second officer said. Galaxy-wide, Krieg waved a hand dismissively. Expected. Let them beg. No one will come. One species acknowledged, sir. Humans. That made Krieg pause. He pulled up the file on his screen. Humans. Recent addition to galactic civilization. No significant military presence. Avoided the census conflicts 30 years ago by claiming neutrality. They had been left alone because they seemed harmless. How many ships? Unknown, sir. A scout vessel entered the system 3 hours ago, performed scans, and left. A scout? Krieg laughed. They sent one ship to look at us? Tell me when they arrive with their rescue fleet. I could use the entertainment. Below on Sanctuary, Mira sat in an emergency bunker with what remained of her government. The bombardment countdown showed 58 hours. Every minute felt like falling. She had moved her office underground when the orbital defenses fell. Now she lived in recycled air and artificial light while her people prepared to die. Any word from the humans? She asked the same question she had asked every hour since Paul's message. Nothing, her assistant said. Just that one scout ship. Tess leaned forward. What if they're not coming? What if that scout was just curiosity? Then we die, Mira said simply. There was no point in pretending anymore. But until the bombardment starts, we keep hoping. In his research station, Paul could not sleep. He kept reading the human cultural files, trying to understand what kind of species they had called. The historical records were disturbing. Humans had fought wars with primitive weapons that killed millions before they even developed spaceflight. They had used chemical weapons, biological weapons, even split atoms to create bombs that destroyed entire cities. But they had also created beautiful art, music that made Paul's translator struggle to convey the emotion, literature about love, loss, hope. They were contradictions, capable of terrible violence but also deep compassion. Beth found him at his desk, surrounded by human data files. You should rest. I'm trying to understand them, Paul said. The humans. I found something called the World War II. They fought each other for 6 years. The entire planet was involved. Over 70 million dead. Why are you telling me this? Beth asked. Because that was 80 years ago. The species that did that is the species coming to help us. Or maybe not help us. I don't know anymore. Beth sat down beside him. We asked for help. They answered. That's something. Paul wanted to believe her. But the more he read, the more uncertain he became. Humans had a saying he kept finding in their literature. War never changes. They seemed to accept violence as part of their nature. Most species grew past their aggressive phases. Humans appeared to simply redirect theirs. Back on the command ship, Krieg was eating his evening meal when the communications officer interrupted. Sir, we've detected slipspace signatures. Multiple contacts heading our way. Krieg set down his food. The humans? Unknown, sir. The signatures don't match our database. But they're coming from the direction of human space. How many? The officer checked his instruments. Calculating now, sir. At least 40 contacts, possibly more. Krieg stood up. 40 ships. That was more than he expected, but still nothing compared to his 200. Battle stations. Prepare to engage if they enter the system. The next 6 hours passed slowly. Krieg's fleet formed defensive positions around Sanctuary. The unknown contacts approached steadily, not rushing but not hesitating either. Whoever they were, they knew Krieg was waiting. Then they arrived. Reality seemed to tear open at the edge of the system, and ships emerged from slipspace. Krieg stared at the tactical display, his confidence wavering for the first time. There were not 40 ships. There were 50. All of them were warships clearly designed for combat. They moved in perfect formation, which suggested serious military training. The designs were unlike anything in the Galactic database, angular, utilitarian. Every surface seemed designed for function over form. They bristled with weapons, missiles, kinetic guns, energy weapons Krieg did not recognize. These were not merchant vessels converted for defense. These were purpose-built war machines. Identification? Krieg demanded. Confirmed human registry, sir. Lead ship identifies as UWNS Indomitable. Fleet commander is Admiral Hayes. A message came through. Text only. Simple and direct. All Dominion vessels. You have 10 minutes to withdraw beyond the heliopause or be fired upon. Krieg read it twice. Then he started laughing. His bridge crew looked confused. 10 minutes? They give me an ultimatum? Count the ships. I have 200 warships. They have 50. The mathematics are clear. His tactical officer looked worried. Sir, their formation is extremely tight. That level of coordination suggests advanced AI or exceptional training. They're merchants playing soldier, Krieg said. Send a response. Tell them to leave or be destroyed. The humans did not respond. They simply waited. Krieg watched the countdown. 10 minutes. The humans held position at the system's edge, not advancing but not retreating. Were they bluffing? Hoping he would panic and run? That was insulting. On Sanctuary, Paul watched the sensor data with his heart pounding. 50 human ships had arrived. The design schematic showed vessels built for one purpose, war. Every weapon system was active. Every ship maintained perfect spacing. They moved like a single organism. They're really here, Beth whispered beside him. Mira received the tactical report in her bunker. 50 ships against 200. The numbers were bad, but it was 50 more than they had yesterday. She sent a message to the human fleet. This is Mira of the Talaran Union. Thank you for coming. Please be careful. The Dominion fleet is much larger. Admiral Hayes responded immediately. His voice was calm, almost tired. We see them. Hold your position. This will be over soon. The 10 minutes expired. Krieg smiled. The humans had not moved. All ships prepare to fire. Target their command vessel. Let's end this quickly. Before he could give the order, the human fleet moved. They did not charge forward. They did not scatter. They simply shifted formation, and suddenly Krieg's tactical display lit up with warnings. The humans had launched missiles, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They spread across space like a swarm. Point defense, engage, Krieg shouted. The Dominion ships opened fire, destroying missiles by the dozens. But more kept coming. And they were not flying straight. They jinked and weaved, avoiding fire with coordinated movements. These were not dumb projectiles. These were smart weapons with advanced AI. Then the first missiles got through. They hit a Dominion destroyer and the ship simply came apart. No explosion, no drama. The kinetic impact at relativistic speed transferred so much energy that the hull shattered like glass. Krieg stared in horror as more ships died. 5, 10, 15. His fleet was firing back now, but the human ships were moving, using electronic warfare to blind sensors. His own missiles could not find targets. 20 ships gone. 30. His fleet was in chaos, ships breaking formation, trying to return fire at enemies they could barely detect. All ships, withdraw, Krieg finally shouted. Pride meant nothing if his entire fleet was destroyed. The human ships let them run. They simply held position and watched as the Dominion fleet retreated beyond the system's edge, leaving 43 wrecks behind. Paul could barely breathe. In 15 minutes, the humans had shattered a force 4 times their size. They had not even advanced into the system. They had simply demonstrated overwhelming tactical superiority and then stopped. A message came from Admiral Hayes, broadcast to Sanctuary. You are safe now. We will maintain position until you request otherwise. Mira read the message 3 times, unable to believe it. They had won. The humans had actually won. Mira had never seen a human before. The shuttle landed in the secure zone outside her bunker, and she waited with her security team, unsure what to expect. When the hatch opened, 3 humans emerged wearing plain uniforms without weapons. The one in front was older, gray hair, tired eyes that had seen too much. Admiral Hayes, he said, offering his hand in what Mira recognized as a human greeting. His hand was warm and his grip firm but not aggressive. Thank you for your message. Sorry we couldn't arrive sooner. Mira struggled to find words. This was the man who had just destroyed 40 Dominion ships without losing a single vessel. He looked like a tired office worker. You saved us. I don't know how to thank you. Hayes glanced at his companions, then back to Mira. Let's talk inside. We need to discuss the situation. They moved to the council chamber. Mira's government had many questions, but Hayes spoke first. The Dominion fleet regrouped at the heliopause. They're bringing in reinforcements. We estimate 400 ships within 3 days. The room went silent. Tess spoke first, her voice shaking. 400? You barely defeated 200. We didn't defeat them, Hayes said quietly. We scared them. There's a difference. They retreated because we surprised them with technology and tactics they didn't expect. Now they know what we can do and they're angry. Van leaned forward. Can you defeat 400 ships? Hayes did not answer immediately. He looked at each council member and Mira saw something in his eyes. Calculation. He was measuring them, deciding how much truth they could handle. This was our rapid response fleet. 50 ships designed for quick deployment. Our main battle group is 3 days away. Until then, we hold the line with what we have. Against 8 times your number? Mira asked. Against 8 times our number, Hayes confirmed. We've done worse. Over the next 12 hours, human ships established orbital positions around Sanctuary. Ground shuttles brought medical teams and engineers to help with recovery efforts. Paul volunteered to work as a liaison, and he found himself assigned to a medical frigate called Mercy. The human doctor who greeted him was a woman named Ruth, middle-aged with kind eyes and hands that moved with practiced efficiency. We hear your hospitals are overwhelmed. We're here to help. Paul watched human medics work on Talaran wounded. Their techniques seemed aggressive, cutting, injecting chemicals, using devices that shocked hearts back into rhythm. But the survival rate was remarkable. Talaran doctors had given up on patients the humans saved. Your medicine is very different from ours, Paul said to Ruth during a quiet moment. We're a stubborn species, Ruth said. We don't give up easily. Not on patients, not on anything. Paul saw that stubbornness everywhere. Human engineers worked 20-hour shifts repairing power stations. Human soldiers cleared rubble from collapsed buildings, lifting debris that should have required machinery. They were physically stronger than Talaran, with endurance that seemed impossible. One Marine worked 16 hours straight moving rubble before Paul convinced him to rest. Don't you get tired? Paul asked. The Marine, a young man named Davis, grinned. Sure, but tired beats dead. While humans worked on the surface, Admiral Hayes studied tactical reports on his flagship. His second in command, a woman named Commander Price, stood beside him reviewing the Dominion fleet composition. 400 ships. Heavy cruisers, destroyers, fighter carriers. It was a proper war fleet designed to crush resistance. We can't win this straight fight, Price said. No, Hayes agreed. So we don't fight straight. He pulled up a map of the system. Sanctuary had 2 asteroid belts and a gas giant with 17 moons. Resources they could use. Start mining operations. I want kinetic mines throughout both asteroid belts. Program them to activate on Dominion signatures. That's defensive, Price said. We need offensive options. Hayes smiled, but there was no humor in it. When you're outnumbered 8-1, defense is offense. We make them come to us and we make them pay for every kilometer. The Dominion fleet arrived 60 hours later. Krieg had been demoted for his failure, replaced by High Commander Vok, a veteran of 50 campaigns. Vok studied the human positions with professional interest. They had pulled back to close orbit around Sanctuary, giving up the outer system entirely. Interesting, Vok said. They're not even trying to hold the system perimeter. His tactical officer nodded. They've positioned themselves in a defensive sphere around the planet. We can flank them easily, Or it's a trap, Vok said. What do we know about human tactics? Limited data, sir. They've avoided major conflicts since joining the galactic community, but their weapons technology is more advanced than expected. Vok made his decision. We advance in 3 groups. Primary force engages their defensive sphere. Secondary forces flank through the asteroid belts. We surround them and end this. The Dominion fleet moved in. 400 ships organized and methodical. They had overwhelming numbers and experience. Vok was confident this would be a standard engagement. The first group reached the outer asteroid belt. That was when the mines activated. They were not explosive mines. They were kinetic weapons. Chunks of rock accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed. When they hit, they transferred enormous energy. Vok watched 12 ships vanish from his tactical display. Not destroyed, simply gone, torn apart by impacts that released more energy than most weapons. All ships alert status, Vok commanded. Scan for more mines. But the mines were small and scattered throughout millions of cubic kilometers. Finding them all was impossible. The fleet slowed, trying to pick through the field carefully. That was when the human ships attacked. They did not charge in. They used the asteroid belt as cover, emerging from behind rocks, firing missiles and disappearing again. Hit and run. Guerrilla tactics. The Dominion fleet fired back, but shooting at targets that appeared for seconds before vanishing was nearly impossible. Paul watched from the surface as lights flashed in orbit. Each flash represented ships dying. Sometimes Dominion vessels, sometimes human ones. The battle was not the quick victory from before. This was grinding attrition. A human fighter crashed near his position. Emergency crews rushed to the site. When they pulled the pilot out, Paul was amazed to see her still alive. She had survived G-forces that should have turned her organs to paste. How? Paul asked Ruth, who was treating the pilot. We evolved on a heavy gravity world, Ruth said, working quickly. Our bodies are built for punishment. That's why humans can handle fighter craft better than most species. We can take the acceleration. The pilot, barely conscious, grinned at Paul. Got 3 of them before they got me. The battle raged for 8 hours. The Dominion fleet eventually pushed through the asteroid belts, losing 60 ships in the process. They formed up for a final assault on the human defensive sphere. Vok was frustrated but determined. He still had numerical superiority. All ships advance. Weapons free. And this, the Dominion fleet moved in. The human ships held their position in a tight sphere around Sanctuary. They did not run. They did not scatter. They simply started firing, and space lit up with weapons fire from both sides. Mira watched from her bunker as the battle intensified. Human ships were dying. She could see them breaking apart in orbit. But they never broke formation. Every time a ship fell, another moved to fill the gap. Admiral Hayes sat on his bridge watching tactical displays with professional calm. His fleet was being hammered. 18 ships destroyed 20, but they were holding and the Dominion was paying 3-to-1 for every ship they killed. Main fleet ETA? He asked. 7 hours, sir, Price responded. Hayes nodded. 7 hours. They could last 7 hours. They had to. On the surface, Paul stood with Davis and watched the lights in the sky. Your people are dying up there. Yeah, Davis said quietly. They knew the job when they signed up. Why? Paul asked. Why come at all? We're not your people. Davis looked at him with an expression Paul would remember for the rest of his life. Sad but determined. Maybe not. But you needed help and no one else came. That makes it our job. Sleep had become a memory for Hayes. He stood in his ready room reviewing casualty reports while his fleet fought a desperate holding action. 23 ships lost, 5,000 dead. The numbers kept growing, and each one represented people under his command who would never go home. Commander Price entered without knocking. Her uniform was wrinkled and her eyes showed the same exhaustion Hayes felt. The Dominion pulled back to regroup. They're setting up for another assault in 6 hours. Status of our fleet? 27 ships operational. Ammunition at 40%. Crews are exhausted. We're rotating shifts, but everyone's working double duty. Price hesitated. Sir, we can't hold another assault like the last one. Hayes knew she was right. But the main fleet was still 5 hours away. They needed to buy more time. We'll make them pay for every meter. What's the status on Sanctuary's orbital defenses? We've helped them repair 3 platforms. Not much, but better than nothing. A message came through from the surface. Mira was requesting a meeting. Hayes wanted to refuse. He did not have time for politics, but the Talaran leader had earned his respect. He approved the meeting. 2 hours later, Mira arrived on the flagship. Hayes met her in the observation deck, where she could see the full scope of the battle. Debris fields marked where ships had died. Talaran and human vessels all mixed together in death. "I'm sorry," Mira said immediately. "Your people are dying because of us." Hayes shook his head. "My people are dying because the Dominion decided your species didn't deserve to exist." "There's a difference." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Mira asked the question that had been bothering her since the humans arrived. "Why did you come? You could have ignored our distress call like everyone else. You had no obligation to us." Hayes was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was soft. 80 years ago, my grandfather was a soldier. He fought in something we call World War II. 60 million humans died in that war. When it ended, people made a promise, never again. We would never stand by and watch genocide happen. "But we're not human," Mira said. "No, you're not," Hayes agreed. "But your people." "That's enough." Mira felt tears forming. Her species showed emotion differently than humans, but the meaning was universal. "When this is over, if we survive, the Talaran Union will owe humanity a debt we can never repay." "We're not keeping score," Hayes said. "We just hope you do the same for someone else someday." On the surface, Paul had barely left the human medical ship. He watched Ruth and her team work with a dedication that bordered on obsessive. They refused to give up on patients even when the situation seemed hopeless. A young Talaran girl had been brought in with severe burns. Talaran doctors had already declared her beyond saving. Ruth worked on her for 6 hours straight, using techniques that seemed barbaric but effective. The girl survived. When Paul asked Ruth how she had the energy to keep trying, she looked at him with bloodshot eyes and said, "Because she deserves a chance." They all deserve a chance. Paul realized then that humans did not just fight with weapons. They fought with sheer refusal to accept defeat. It was in everything they did. The Marines who cleared rubble, the engineers who repaired generators, the doctors who saved the dying. They simply would not quit. He found Davis at a collapsed apartment building. The Marine had been working for 18 hours, using human strength to lift debris and search for survivors. Paul joined him, doing what he could to help. "Your people are incredible," Paul said as they worked. "You don't stop." Davis grunted as he lifted a piece of concrete that weighed more than Paul did. "We're stubborn. It's a survival trait. Back on Earth, before we had civilization, the way humans hunted was just following prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. We're not the fastest or the strongest, but we just keep going." They found a family trapped in a basement. 2 adults and 3 children. Davis squeezed through a gap that should have been too small, then spent an hour carefully moving debris to create an escape route. When they finally pulled the family out alive, Davis just moved on to the next building. No celebration, just the next job. That evening, Paul attended a briefing where Admiral Hayes addressed the combined human and Talaran forces. His message was simple and direct. "The Dominion will attack again in a few hours. Our main fleet is still 4 hours away. We need to hold the line. I won't lie to you, this will be hard. We'll lose ships. We'll lose people, but we will hold. Because behind us are 8 billion Talaran who deserve to live." Mira watched Hayes speak and saw the effect his words had on both human and Talaran forces. They straightened. They nodded. They prepared to do the impossible because this man believed they could. After the briefing, Mira spoke with Tess and Ven in private. "We need to do something," she said. "The humans are dying for us and we're just hiding in bunkers. What can we do?" Tess asked. "Our ships are destroyed. We have no military." "We have civilian ships," Ven said slowly. "Cargo haulers. Mining vessels. They're not warships, but they can fly." Mira understood immediately. "We can create interference, distraction. Give the humans some advantage." It was a desperate plan. Talaran civilian ships joining a space battle against warships was suicide. But doing nothing while humans died felt worse. Mira sent a message to Hayes outlining the plan. His response was immediate and firm. "Absolutely not. We're here to save you, not get you killed." Mira sent another message. "With respect, Admiral, this is our world. Our people. You've given us the chance to survive. Now let us fight beside you." Hayes did not respond for 10 minutes. When he did, the message was simple. "Any Talaran ships that join the battle are under my command. You follow orders or you leave. Understood? Mira smiled. That was as close to approval as she was going to get. Within 2 hours, she had organized 200 civilian vessels, cargo ships, mining haulers, even pleasure craft. None of them had weapons beyond basic mining lasers, but they could fly and they could be useful. The Dominion assault began exactly on schedule. High Commander Vok had learned from his mistakes. This time he committed his entire fleet in a coordinated assault, attacking from multiple vectors simultaneously. The human defensive sphere contracted under the pressure. That was when the Talaran civilian fleet arrived. 200 ships that had no business in a war zone jumped into the battle. They did not attack. They simply spread out, creating sensor interference and forcing Dominion ships to maneuver around them. It was chaos, but it disrupted the coordinated assault. Hayes saw what the Talaran were doing and adapted immediately. He directed human ships to use the civilian vessels as cover, emerging from behind cargo haulers to fire missiles before disappearing again. The battle turned into a confused melee where the Dominion's numerical advantage became less relevant. Paul was on one of the civilian ships, a mining hauler called Morning's Hope. They had no weapons, so their job was simple: stay alive and be annoying. The pilot, an older Talaran named Brick, flew with reckless courage, positioning their ship to block firing solutions for Dominion vessels. "We're going to die," the co-pilot said, her voice shaking. "Maybe," Brick said calmly, "but we're going to be useful first." A Dominion destroyer targeted them. Before it could fire, a human frigate appeared from behind Morning's Hope and destroyed the destroyer with a perfect missile strike. The human ship's captain sent a brief message. "Good bait. Keep it up." The battle raged for 3 hours. Human ships continued to fall. Dominion ships fell faster. And then finally, long-range sensors detected the signature everyone had been waiting for. The human main fleet had arrived. 120 warships, fresh and fully armed, led by a massive carrier called Indomitable. They emerged from slipspace in perfect formation and immediately joined the battle. The effect was immediate. The Dominion fleet, already battered and disorganized, found itself suddenly outnumbered. Vok watched his tactical display with growing horror as the new human ships tore through his formations. These were not rapid response vessels. These were main battle units, bigger and more heavily armed. "All ships withdraw," Vok ordered. Pride meant nothing against extinction. The human fleet let them run just like before. When the shooting stopped, the Dominion had lost 230 ships. The humans had lost 31. The Talaran civilian fleet had lost 18 ships, but the rest had survived. Paul found himself sitting on the deck of Morning's Hope, shaking with exhaustion and relief. They had survived. Against all probability, they had survived. Fleet Admiral Park stepped onto the bridge of the Indomitable, with the bearing of someone who had spent 40 years in military service. She was shorter than Hayes, older by a decade, and possessed eyes that evaluated everything with tactical precision. Her arrival had saved the defense fleet, but she knew the Dominion would not simply give up after losing half their forces. "Status report," she ordered as her command staff assembled. Hayes appeared on the main view screen, transmitting from his battered flagship. "We've secured orbit around Sanctuary. Dominion remnants withdrew to deep space. Estimate 3 days before they can organize another assault." "They won't wait 3 days," Park said flatly. "They'll regroup and come back angrier. The Dominion doesn't accept defeats like this. It makes them look weak." She was right. Across the system, the scattered Dominion forces were already consolidating. Vok had been executed for his failure, replaced by war leader Dren, a fanatic known for brutal tactics. Dren reviewed the battle recordings with cold fury. The humans had humiliated the Dominion twice now. That could not stand. "How many ships do we have operational?" Dren demanded. 163, war leader. "More reinforcements arrive in 30 hours. We attack before then," Dren said. "I want the humans destroyed and the Talaran planet burned. No mercy. No survivors." His officers exchanged glances but said nothing. Dren was known for sacrificing his own ships to achieve victory. He considered crew lives irrelevant compared to Dominion honor. On Sanctuary, the human presence had transformed the recovery effort. Admiral Park visited the surface to inspect conditions and meet with Mira. The two leaders walked through a district that had been rubble a week ago, but now showed signs of rebuilding. Human engineers worked alongside Talaran civilians, sharing techniques and tools. "Your people work fast," Mira observed. We're motivated, Park said. The Dominion won't give up. We need you combat ready as soon as possible. Mira felt a chill. You think they'll attack again? I know they will. The Dominion doesn't retreat. They regroup. Park stopped walking and looked directly at Mira. I need you to be realistic about what's coming. This won't be like the last battles. They'll come with everything they have and they'll be willing to lose ships just to hurt us. What do you need from us? More civilian volunteers, Park said. I know you lost ships in the last battle, but those civilian vessels made a difference. We need every advantage we can get. Mira wanted to refuse. Asking her people to risk their lives again felt cruel. But Park was right. The Dominion would not stop unless they were forced to stop. I'll talk to them. That evening, Paul attended a meeting where Mira addressed the Talaran people through planet-wide broadcast. She did not sugarcoat the situation. The Dominion would attack again. Humans were preparing to defend them again, and the Talaran people had a choice: hide and hope others died protecting them, or stand beside those who had already sacrificed so much. The response surprised everyone. Within 12 hours, 500 civilian ships volunteered. Miners, cargo haulers, passenger transports, all piloted by people who had never been in combat. Admiral Park worked with Hayes to organize them into useful formations. They could not fight, but they could serve as mobile sensor platforms, emergency rescue vehicles, and yes, occasionally as bait to disrupt enemy formations. Davis found Paul at the volunteer coordinator's office. The Marine had barely slept since the last battle, but he was back on duty helping train Talaran civilians in emergency procedures. You volunteering again? Davis asked. Yes, Paul said. Are you trying to talk me out of it? Nope, just wanted to say you did good last time. For someone who's never been in combat, you kept your head. They worked together to prepare a cargo hauler called New Dawn for civilian fleet duty. The modifications were simple: enhanced sensors, emergency thrusters, and reinforced life support. Nothing that would let it fight, but enough to keep it alive longer. Can I ask you something? Paul said as they worked. Why do humans do this? Fight for others? Davis thought about that while calibrating a sensor array. We've got a lot of history on Earth. Humans have done terrible things to each other. Wars, genocides, all of it. But we've also learned something. Evil wins when good people do nothing. So when we see something wrong, we try to fix it. Even if it costs your lives? Especially then, Davis said quietly. Because if we're not willing to die for what's right, then what's the point of living? The Dominion attack came sooner than expected. Only 24 hours after Park's arrival, sensors detected the enemy fleet approaching at high speed. Dren had not waited for reinforcements. He was bringing 160 ships in a desperate assault, meant to overwhelm the human defenses through sheer aggression. Admiral Park studied the tactical display with professional calm. He's gambling everything on this attack. If we break him here, the Dominion will have to withdraw entirely. And if we don't break him, Commander Price asked, then we all die, Park said simply. All ships, battle stations. Civilian fleet, get into position. This is going to be rough. The Dominion fleet entered the system at maximum speed, not bothering with tactical formations or careful approaches. They charged straight for Sanctuary like a hammer aimed at glass. Dren's strategy was simple: hit the human fleet so hard and fast they would not have time to use their tactical advantages. It almost worked. The human fleet barely had time to form defensive positions before the Dominion crashed into them. Ships on both sides died in the opening minutes. The space around Sanctuary became a nightmare of weapons fire, exploding ships, and debris fields. Paul sat in the co-pilot seat of New Dawn as Brick maneuvered through the chaos. Their job was to stay alive and relay sensor data to the human fleet. Simple in theory. In practice, it meant dodging missiles and flying through debris while Dominion ships tried to kill anything that moved. Contact left, the sensor officer shouted. Brick banked hard, and a missile flew past where they had been a moment before. Paul's stomach tried to climb out through his throat. He had survived the last battle, but this one felt different. More desperate, more vicious. Hayes watched from his flagship as the battle devolved into a brutal slugging match. The Dominion was not using tactics anymore. They were just throwing ships forward, accepting casualties to get close enough to do damage. It was costing them 3 ships for every human vessel destroyed, but Dren did not care. He was willing to lose his entire fleet if it meant crushing the humans. We need to break their momentum, Hayes said. Target their command ship. If we kill Dren, maybe the rest will break. Finding Dren's flagship in the chaos was nearly impossible. But the human AI systems were good at pattern recognition. They identified the most heavily protected Dominion vessel and designated it as the primary target. Every available human ship concentrated fire on that single target. Dren saw what they were doing and laughed. Let them try. His flagship had the best shields and armor in the fleet. It would take more than human missiles to. The kinetic rounds hit at relativistic speed. Dren's flagship did not explode. It simply ceased to exist, torn apart by impacts that released more energy than nuclear weapons. The surrounding Dominion ships were damaged by debris moving at lethal velocities. For a moment, the Dominion fleet faltered. Without central command, ships began making individual decisions. Some pressed the attack. Others tried to retreat. The coordination fell apart. Park saw the opening and exploited it ruthlessly. All ships divide and conquer. Break them into small groups and eliminate them. The human fleet shifted from defensive formations to aggressive pursuit. They singled out isolated Dominion ships and destroyed them methodically. The battle became a chase, with human vessels hunting down enemies one by one. Paul watched from New Dawn as the tide turned. Dominion ships were running now, trying to escape to deep space. Some made it. Most did not. The human fleet was relentless, pursuing until every enemy vessel was either destroyed or had fled the system entirely. When the shooting finally stopped, the casualty reports came in. The humans had lost 40 ships. The Dominion had lost 120. It was a decisive victory, but the cost had been terrible. Paul found Davis on the surface later that day. The Marine was sitting on a pile of rubble, staring at nothing. Paul sat beside him. "We won," Paul said. "Yeah," Davis said quietly. "We won." They sat in silence, two people from different worlds sharing the exhaustion that came after surviving something that should have killed them. Around them, humans and Talaran worked together to rebuild. The war was not over, but for now they had earned a moment of peace. The Dominion High Council met in emergency session, watching battle recordings from Sanctuary with growing alarm. 3 separate fleets had been sent to crush a minor species. All 3 had been destroyed or driven off by humans, a species most of them had barely heard of 3 weeks ago. "This is unacceptable," Supreme Leader Koth declared. "We cannot allow such humiliation to stand. The entire galaxy is watching, that was the problem." Every species with long-range sensors had monitored the battles. Every government had received recordings of human ships systematically dismantling Dominion forces. The empire that had seemed invincible now looked vulnerable. Border territories were already showing signs of unrest. Species that had accepted Dominion rule were questioning whether they needed to anymore. "We need to make a decision," Koth continued. "Commit overwhelming force to crush both the humans and the Talaran, or accept this defeat and consolidate our holdings." The council argued for hours. Some wanted revenge. Others pointed out the cost of continuing. The humans had revealed military capabilities that matched or exceeded Dominion technology. Committing more fleets risked greater losses. Finally, pragmatism won. The Dominion would withdraw from Talaran space and avoid direct conflict with humanity for now. It was not surrender, they told themselves. It was strategic patience. Admiral Park received confirmation of the Dominion withdrawal while standing on Sanctuary's surface, watching reconstruction efforts. Hayes stood beside her, both of them exhausted but relieved. "They're pulling back their border fleets," Park said, reading the intelligence report. "Not just here. Across 4 sectors, species that have been occupied for decades are seeing Dominion forces leave." "So we won," Hayes said. "We survived," Park corrected. "Winning implies this is over." "It's not. We just changed the equation." She was right. Across human space, governments were having urgent discussions about what their new role in the galaxy would be. For 40 years, humanity had maintained peaceful neutrality, avoiding the major power struggles. That was no longer possible. They had revealed themselves as a military power. Species would seek them as allies or fear them as threats. Mira addressed her people from the rebuilt government center. The building still showed damage. Walls were cracked, windows were temporary, but it stood as a symbol of survival. Beside her stood Admiral Park and Admiral Hayes, representing the alliance that had saved the Talaran Union. "We asked for help when no one else would come," Mira said. Her voice broadcast across the planet and transmitted to every ship in orbit. The humans answered. "They fought beside us. They died for us. 23,000 human lives were lost defending our world. We will never forget this debt. It's not a debt, Hayes said when Mira finished. It's what neighbors do. The formal alliance ceremony followed. The Talaran Union and humanity signed treaties of mutual defense, trade agreements, and cultural exchange programs. It was the beginning of something larger. Other species had watched the battle. Some began sending diplomatic messages to human space, expressing interest in similar alliances. Paul sat with Davis in a small cafe that had reopened in the city center. Around them, Talaran civilians mixed with human soldiers and engineers. The two species were learning to coexist, sharing stories and beginning friendships that would last lifetimes. What happens now? Paul asked. The Dominion will not forget what happened here. No, they won't, Davis agreed. But they'll think twice before trying again. Sometimes that's the best you can do. Make the cost of attacking too high. Is that how humans think? Everything is about cost and benefit? Davis shook his head. Not everything. We came here because it was right, not because we calculated some benefit. But we're not stupid either. Making an example of the Dominion helps prevent future genocides. Other aggressive species will see what happened and maybe reconsider their plans. Paul thought about that. The humans were complex, capable of great violence but also great compassion. They fought not for conquest but for principles. It made them unpredictable and dangerous and admirable all at once. I read more of your history, Paul said. After our last conversation, you have a phrase, never again. It appears in your literature after great tragedies. Yeah, Davis said quietly. It's something we say after we fail to prevent something terrible. We promise ourselves we won't let it happen again. But you cannot prevent everything, Paul said. The galaxy is too large. Too many species. Too many conflicts. We can't save everyone, Davis agreed. But we can try. And when someone calls for help, we can answer. Admiral Park prepared to depart with the main battle fleet. She met with Hayes in private before leaving. You did good work here. Against impossible odds. We had help, Hayes said, nodding toward the window where Talaran ships could be seen working alongside human vessels. They fought for themselves when it mattered. That's important, Park said. We can't protect everyone, but we can help people protect themselves. That's going to be our role going forward. Not conquerors, not police, but allies who respond when called. She paused, then continued. The government wants me to establish a rapid response command. Multiple fleets positioned throughout our sphere of influence, ready to deploy within days to any crisis. They're calling it the Humanitarian Defense Initiative. That's a hell of a responsibility, Hayes said. It is. That's why I want you to help run it. You proved you can make the hard calls and live with the consequences. Hayes looked out at Sanctuary, the planet that had been dying when he arrived. Now it lived, and its people were rebuilding with hope instead of despair. I'll think about it. Weeks later, the galactic news networks finally caught up to what had happened at Sanctuary. The recording spread across every civilized system. Species watched human ships methodically dismantling forces that outnumbered them. They watched human Marines work 20-hour shifts to save civilian lives. They watched human medics refuse to give up on dying patients. The Dominion tried to control the narrative, but the evidence was overwhelming. They had committed 3 fleets to genocide and been defeated by a species that had been dismissed as insignificant. Border species began declaring independence. The Dominion's territory contracted for the first time in a century. Paul was promoted to liaison officer for human relations. His job was to help the two species understand each other. He spent his days answering questions about humans and explaining Talaran culture to human visitors. It was challenging work, but important. One question kept coming up from both sides. Why did the humans come? Other species could not understand it. Humans had nothing to gain. They risked their own people for strangers. It did not fit the normal patterns of galactic politics where every action had a calculated benefit. Paul tried to explain it during a conference with other species. Humans have a concept they call conscience. It means they must live with their choices. When they heard our distress call, they could have ignored it like everyone else, but then they would have to live knowing they let an entire species die when they could have helped. That cost was greater than the risk of fighting. Not everyone understood. Some species dismissed it as propaganda. Others found it frightening. A species that made decisions based on abstract principles rather than concrete benefits was unpredictable. But some understood and began reaching out to humanity, seeking alliances based on shared values rather than simple mutual benefit. A year later, Sanctuary was almost fully rebuilt. The scars remained, buildings with patched walls, memorials for the dead, but life had returned to normal. Paul stood at one memorial, looking at the names of human soldiers who had died defending his world. 23,000 names carved in stone. Davis joined him. The Marine had stayed as part of the permanent human liaison mission. He had learned to speak Talaran fluently and had become popular with local civilians for his willingness to help with any problem. "I still think about that first conversation we had," Paul said. "When you said you were stubborn, I did not understand what you meant then. And now? Now I understand that stubbornness is refusing to accept defeat, refusing to give up, refusing to let evil win just because it's easier to look away." Davis nodded. "That's part of it. The other part is remembering that someone has to stand up. If everyone waits for someone else to act, nothing happens. So when we saw your distress call, we decided we'd be the ones to stand up." They stood in comfortable silence, watching Talaran children play in a park that had been rubble a year ago. Those children would grow up in a world that knew it was not alone. That knew when they called for help, someone would answer. Admiral Hayes accepted the position with the Humanitarian Defense Initiative. Under his leadership, rapid response fleets were positioned throughout human-allied space. When the small colony of Breskin was attacked by raiders, a human fleet arrived within 3 days. When the mining station at Telos suffered a catastrophic accident, human rescue ships were there in hours. When the peaceful Norvani asked for help training a defense force, human instructors arrived to teach them. Slowly, the galaxy changed. Not everywhere. Not completely. The Dominion still controlled vast territories. Other aggressive species still raided and conquered. But now there was an alternative. Species being threatened knew they could call for help and humanity would respond. Not for profit. Not for territory. Simply because it was right. Paul concluded his report on human-Talaran relations with a personal observation. "We called for help when we were dying. The humans came. They fought, they bled, they died for people they had never met, and when it was over, they asked for nothing in return except that we extend the same hand to others someday. This is who they are. This is why the galaxy will never be the same." Mira read his report and added it to the official archives. Then she looked out her window at a sky free from Dominion ships, at a city rebuilding, at a people who had hope again. The humans had given them that, not through conquest or occupation, but through the simple act of answering when someone called for help. She sent a message to Admiral Hayes wherever he was now. "Thank you for teaching us that the galaxy can be better than it is. We will remember." Hayes read the message on his flagship, preparing for another deployment to another crisis. He smiled and sent a brief reply. "Just pass it forward when someone else needs help." That's payment enough. And across the galaxy, that message spread. Species began forming defensive pacts, not for conquest, but for mutual protection. The Dominion's expansion stopped. Other aggressive empires faced coordinated resistance. It was not peace. Conflict still existed, but it was different. Better. Because now, when the weak called for help, they knew someone would answer. They called it victory. Paul called it hope. The humans called it their duty. Whatever the name, the galaxy had changed forever. And at the center of that change was a simple truth. Evil had tried to triumph, but good people had refused to do nothing.